Senator Back in continuation.
Thank you, Mr President. I'm delighted to continue my comments on this particular bill. And to draw attention to the chamber, Mr President, it's always easy in 2017 to have a look and say, oh, the North West Shelf is there, Gorgon and Wheatstone are there, Ichthys is there, the Queensland projects are there. They weren't always there. And I draw attention to the chamber that back in the 1970s, Sir Charles Court, the absolute dynamo of Western Australia and Australian industry, negotiated at that time with the federal government that there be a more fair sharing of the royalties and the income that would come from the possibility of a North West Shelf. Remember, Woodside had made no investment, there was a prospectivity, but there was no wealth. And it's easy in this year to look back and say, look how much money we've all made out of it, and we're rushing towards being the world's biggest exporter of LNG. But in the 1970s, President, there was nothing there, and a huge risk was taken. And quite correctly, Sir Charles Court said to the Prime Minister of the day, we in Western Australia are going to take the risks. We're going to be doing the work. You will enjoy the royalty benefit of the LNG that might come from the success of a North West Shelf. And so as a result of that, there was a decision taken at the time that should there be any gas and condensate found, there would be no tax at all to the company on condensate, to give them the incentive so that in the possibility of there being some success of that exploration, they would at least have a motivation and an incentive. Well, as we know, along came Prime Minister Rudd and he put paid to what had been a long-established principle. But the importance of this legislation, of this bill before us today, President, is that it takes into account the sharing between the Commonwealth Government and the state or states in terms of royalty income. And as we know, on the seabed you've got hydrocarbons move. They might be in state waters. If they are within or around an island, they may be in Commonwealth waters. And as extraction takes place, the hydrocarbons move. So this is part of the reason for the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Amendment bill coming before us. And I'm delighted that Senator Moore yesterday courteously supported on behalf of her party this particular bill and made some very good points in terms of resources and in terms of their contribution, and in terms indeed, as she was mentioning, the efforts in Western Australia of the member for the Pilbara, Mr Grills, in which he would be absolutely torpedoing future investment in that particular case in the iron ore industry as a result of ill-founded and poorly thought-out claims for his own cheap political advantage. So, as a result of the efforts of Charles Court and others, Mr President, the decision was taken at that time that there should be some preference for domestic gas supply. Now, why would that be? Simply because at that time the risk was on the people of Western Australia. Charles Court negotiated what was called a take-or-pay agreement. In other words, should Woodside proceed and should they find gas, then there would be an automatic market for that gas. And at that time, of course, as I know myself, in WA there was no reticulated supply of gas. So the people of Western Australia, and indeed Alcoa, the aluminium company themselves, took an undertaking that they would purchase in advance significant proportions of that natural gas. So today, indeed, we have a scenario in place in WA where at least 15% of all new LNG supply is guaranteed for domestic gas, and that is something, Mr. President, that I would humbly request through you that I have some respect for.
Yes, thank you, Senator.
At least
Back.
quiet.
Could I just invite all senators, if they are holding conversations, if they don't need to be in the chamber, to hold those outside the chamber, just so we can hear Senator Back in silence, and it is disruptive. Senator Back, you have.
Thank you very much. I would have liked to have contributed to how the UN went from my time in 2013, so maybe we continue that discussion at a later stage. I was just concluding on the observation that in Western Australia now, as a result of the risk taken by the Western Australian community through the then Premier Charles Court, that the risk associated with the development of North West Shelf gas was taken by the people of WA and indeed Alcoa. And of course today it's wonderful. We have a Pilbara to Bunbury gas pipeline, gas is reticulated everywhere, and if indeed states like Victoria and South Australia and Queensland don't get their act together in terms of gas exploration and extraction, there's already talk, President, of there being huge storage facilities either offshore Victoria or on land to provide gas for Victoria from elsewhere, or indeed, as I had a discussion recently with our now ambassador to Japan, the Honourable Richard Court, son of Sir Charles. He and I discussed the prospect of whether or not there could indeed be a gas pipeline across the Nullarbor so that we could supply these other states who seem to be most intransigent when it comes to guaranteeing a supply of product that will guarantee to keep their lights on in those states, as South Australia is already in a parlous state with its ill-founded decision to move towards a wind turbine-dominated supply. My good colleague Senator Hume, kind enough to sit here and support me in this contribution, knows already Victoria has discontinued or is discontinuing coal-fired power, and Victoria will find itself in the same position that South Australia is today. President, I want to draw to the attention in relation to this whole question of the offshore gas that is the subject of this bill, just how important and the scale of operations that have been going on offshore WA and indeed in Queensland onshore with the supply being exported from Gladstone. The two big projects of which the Chevron company is the major promoter, Gorgon on Barrow Island and Wheatstone at Exmouth, they are together a $100 billion project, part of $200 billion of investment in Australia in LNG. Let me put into perspective, if I may, in today's dollars, Mr President, the entire Snowy Mountains scheme in today's dollars is $8 billion. 8. Now, we quite rightly are very proud of the Snowy Mountains scheme, the time that it was undertaken, the use of the people displaced out of Europe. Snowy Mountains, of course, a phenomenal project, and of course even today delivering hydroelectricity for which we should all have enormous hope into the future. But Snowy Mountains was an $8 billion project in 2016 dollars. Gorgon and Wheatstone between them, $100 billion. And it's important to reflect, Mr President, on those who seem for some reason or other to want to be dismissive of LNG and its contribution to the Australian economy. Let me just share with the chamber and those who might be interested. I mentioned $200 billion of investment in LNG. That is a third of all investment coming into this country. In terms of revenue back to government, oil and gas production and exploration in 2011-12 put in $30 billion to the Australian economy, contributing 2%. But as we move in 2018-19 to being the world's largest exporter of LNG, that figure of $30 billion by 2020 will increase to $65 billion of revenue. That represents 3.5% of Australia's GDP. Industry to date has paid 8.8. I'll repeat that. For all these allegations about the fact that the resources sector doesn't seem to make its contribution in company taxes, etc., let me repeat that figure. In 2011-12, the industry paid to the Australian government $8.8 billion in income tax, corporate taxes and resource royalties. But the news is even better. That $8.8 billion directly into the Australian economy, by 2020, only in 3 years' time, it increases to $12 12.8, nearly $13 billion of income tax, corporate tax and royalties into our economy. What does that build? For example, that would build 6 new state-of-the-art major teaching hospitals in cities or towns around Australia. Just that contribution. And I'm often told, oh, well, it doesn't contribute much by way of jobs. 103,000 jobs. I see the Minister for Resources nodding his head because he has now, on behalf of the government and the people of Australia, the responsibility and the accountability to carry that case for industry into this place. Over 100,000 high-paying jobs, principally for Australians. Acting Deputy President, and I know your support for the resources sector in our home state of Western Australia. But it gets better than that, because yes, it's true, Gorgon, in terms of its establishment and construction, is coming to a close. It has 3 gas trains, trains 1 and 2 up and running now, train 3 by the end of this year. And I was privileged, along with Mr Gary Gray and Melissa Price from Durack and others, to be there on Barrow Island for the first shipment of LNG to leave Western Australia from the Gorgon project. Down at Wheatstone there are 2 trains. One of them will be operating in full by the middle of this year, and the other one by about the middle of next year. What is interesting in all that, Acting Deputy President, is that for the next 40 years, an LNG ship will leave Western Australian waters every 72 hours for the next 40 years. And yes, it is the case that there is a petroleum resource rent tax, and it is designed so that the costs of establishment, of exploration establishment, and bringing into production these huge projects can actually be accounted for up front, so that there is encouragement to invest and continue to invest in this country. And yes, it is the case that there is then a delay in some of the returns to the federal government by way of royalties. But let me make these 2 points. The first is that the Western Australian particularly, I can't speak with any experience about Queensland, but a lot of the gas reserves, whilst they're enormous, are marginal in terms of cost. And through you, Acting Deputy President, I hope the Minister is taking careful notes. Because they are marginal, this is the incentive to go ahead and invest on the North West Shelf, Woodside with Pluto, Chevron with Gorgon and with Wheatstone, and the new facilities offshore, Scarborough, Browse, terms with which you are very, very familiar. And the other point I want to make is that Australia is a very, very high-cost location into which investment can be made. Even the Gulf of Mexico, infinitely cheaper than Australia. The South China Sea, offshore Brazil. These locations are very attractive. So I say to my colleagues who are making decisions at this time in terms of the review of the petroleum resource rent tax, for heaven's sake, do not bite the hand that feeds you, because I go back to that comment I just made a moment ago. Just one company, Chevron, there will be an LNG ship every 72 hours for 40 years. We are all aware of the excellence of the North West Shelf, the work undertaken by Woodside at Rankin and North Rankin, and more recently at Pluto. And Woodside, of course, have the opportunity with Sunrise in the Timor Sea. They have the opportunity on the Browse Basin. And I come then, of course, in terms of the outlook for the future, and I refer to the new concept of floating LNG. And we know, of course, of the enormous vessel, the largest vessel ever built by the Shell company in Korea, Shell Prelude. The Prelude project, what is it and how is it different? Because Shell have combined all their expertise of hundreds of years into shipping, into the construction of LNG facilities, into the conduct, maintenance and operation of LNG, and they've put it into the one floating structure, which of course, as we know, will be on their project Offshore WA. Where is the excitement for us, Acting Deputy President? The excitement is this is a world first, and it's in our patch. We have followed the rest of the world, Stavanger in Norway, Houston in Texas, Aberdeen in Scotland. But this time round, we're the first. Australia, Australians, Western Australians have the opportunity to get in on the ground floor in terms of the operation and conduct of the new Shell Prelude project. And of course, in the event that it succeeds, we will see more floating structures. Why? Because unlike a fixed structure, if and when supply runs out, you can move that vessel, that whole LNG platform, you can move it to a new location and you can continue well into the future. How exciting! How exciting is this in our world where we have the capacity with our TAFE, with our higher education institutions in WA and indeed nationally, to lead the world in this new floating LNG technology. And of course, coming back to the bill that is before us, you can now understand the importance of this place legislating to ensure that wherever that floating LNG structure is placed, we know in advance what the sharing will be in terms of revenues through royalties to the states and to the federal government. But in the few minutes left available to me, I make this plea on behalf of Western Australia. It is the case, as you know, that to support these projects, they are in the Pilbara, a long distance from Perth. We know that the community of WA has got to invest heavily in roads, in housing, in schools, in communities to support the people who run and operate these projects. But in a scenario in which the royalty income comes back to the federal government for the benefit of all Australians, there must be a provision for the people of the state who spend the money so that the overall community of Australia can benefit. And that's the critically important point. We must think nationally, but we must act locally so that we continue to attract, we continue to see, we continue to enjoy the benefits that will come to us over many years. And the final point to be made today is the day in which the Woodside Company are launching their first ever LNG-powered, what's called a PSV, a platform supply vessel, in Fremantle. And more the pity that we can't be there to enjoy it. First time in the Southern Hemisphere, but of course the big ships that operate backwards and forwards are themselves powered by LNG. It's a good luck story. I support this bill and I commend it to the Senate.